The presentation I'm bringing to you is in Dutch in the slides, but I'm going to be speaking in English, and then from time to time I will ask somebody to read out what is on the slide in Dutch, not with every slide, but with some of them. If you would like to find out more about the organization I'm from, Creation Ministries International has a website, as most organizations do today. It's easy to remember. It's creation.com. And you can find a huge amount of information on this website. It is an online library with about 9,000 articles in up to 29 languages. There are some in Dutch, but there's also a very good website in Dutch with my friends from Media Group in Genesis, which is www.scheppingovevolutie.nl. I apologize for the Dutch pronunciation. That is also extremely good. And I would encourage you, after this session, to sign up for a newsletter from both creation.com, which looks like this. Just put your email address, and that will give you highlights of things which appear on this website daily. Every 2 weeks that InfoBytes comes out. It's something perhaps like this to look at, depending on what is pictured. This, for example, is discussing the Hollywood film, which I imagine will be in Dutch at some point, starring Russell Crowe as Noah. The film is called Noah, and it comes out in the United States at the end of March 2014, and in the UK a week later. Maybe it's already on its way to the Netherlands, I don't know. But it's not a Christian movie, although the ark, Noah's Ark, appears to be much more like the dimensions given in the Bible. It's actually very realistic from the point of view of the size and dimensions of the ark. But there are many aspects of this story which are completely wrong compared to Scripture. For example, God does not send the flood to judge the world because of sin, but because human beings have been destroying the planet. It's an environmental catastrophe from God's point of view. So rather inconsistently, God is angry with human beings and destroys the planet completely. Noah is then saving animals for the world afterwards, and he makes it clear to his wife that human beings are the biggest problem. The director of this movie is a radical environmentalist, and Noah is depicted as someone who claims that if his grandchildren are daughters, he will kill them. And one of his daughters-in-law becomes pregnant on the ark. She gives birth to twin baby girls, and he sets out to kill those baby girls, aided by the animals, but cannot bring himself to carry it out. The film then pictures Noah being much more compassionate than God, and he says to God, "I'm sorry, I cannot bring myself to do it." The world's secular media will be talking about this movie. It's a wonderful opportunity for Christians to engage and to make sure we know what the real truth of that story is. That's the kind of thing we write about, and you can get InfoBytes, as it's called. But you can also sign up for this website, Media Group in Genesis' website, using a form that looks like this at the back, and they also occasionally publish something in Dutch. Some of the material in Dutch is on this website, is translated from creation.com. So do use these resources. I want to talk to you about how to effectively communicate this creation-evolution controversy to school children. As teachers or prospective teachers of primary school children, and anyone listening to the video, anybody interested in this issue, you know what you believe. And if you grew up in a Christian home, if you've had an upbringing that assumes Christian faith, then you have perhaps strong convictions. And I suspect you are familiar with some of the scientific evidences that support a creationist view of the world rather than an evolutionary view of the world. But how would you effectively communicate your convictions, what you believe to be true, to children, to young people? They hear so many voices in this world they live in, as is true of us as adults as well. Think of the adult world for a moment. And here we are living today, whether it's the Netherlands or the country I'm from, the United Kingdom, or any other Western country, we are living in a pagan culture, largely, where the media has great influence. Plus the books we read, the schools that many people go to, if they're not, for instance, in the Dutch Reform schools in the Netherlands, they are getting something rather different from what they might get in the Dutch Reform schools. Christians are challenged in the Bible not to be conformed, not to be influenced by the thinking of this world, but to have a transformed mind so that they can approve what is the perfect will of God, and then to influence society accordingly. But increasingly, it's my conviction that the church is being adversely influenced by the world. The world's culture, the secular media, and so on, are influencing the church often more than the church is being salt and light in the world. That very much depends on the denomination and how biblically based it is, but I'm using that, describing the state of churches generally, not necessarily any one denomination. And so, if adults struggle with these questions about origins, is it any wonder that children also struggle, also have many questions? So if people are not sure about their foundation as parents or teachers of children, then children are unlikely to be sure about their foundation. And if you don't have a strong foundation for a building, of course, cracks can appear in the structure. It's the same for faith. If we don't have a strong foundation for our faith, cracks can appear in our faith, in our understanding of the world around us, and how our faith connects to that real world. In the Bible, Peter, the apostle, encourages believers to be ready to give an answer. 1 Peter 3:15 says this.
Heiligt God de Heer in uw harten en zijt altijd bereid tot verantwoording af te leggen aan ieder die uw rekenschap afwijst van de hoop die in u is, met zachtmoedigheid en vrezen.
And I believe included in this defense of the faith, or giving answers, is the need to do that for our children, whether we have children of our own or children in our care as teachers. We need to be able to train young people also to defend their beliefs from a very young age. In my own country, in the last year, the Department of Education has made it clear that evolutionary teaching will be actively taught from age 5 in primary schools, age 5 onwards. And so it's very important that we start young with our teaching those children the alternative, especially if you believe it's the truth. Here is another verse from Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6. Many people would say this is not a guarantee. Certainly, it's an important principle that we should train our children up in the way that we wish them to go, so that when they are older, they will not depart from that. And if you're a person of faith, Christian faith, you want to make sure you influence children according to your convictions. It's a privilege to share with you, some of you as prospective primary school teachers, on this sort of issue. I do not claim to be able to give you the last word or all of the important points. I have been a teacher of science at secondary level from 11 years old upwards. I've never formally taught children in a school, although I've had children of my own, and I've also taught in schools on this topic. So I hope that some of the principles I can share are of use to you this afternoon. Secular teaching that is not based on the Bible, which isn't necessarily wrong in itself, but often is in contrast or in conflict with the Bible. Whether it's from television, radio programs, magazines, the internet, from their peer group, their people of their own age in school, or from their teachers, it helps shape the worldview of those children. So while the teaching, for example, in the reform schools in the Netherlands is obviously going to be quite very different from what some young people are being taught in the Netherlands, we all know that there are many other influences in a child's life which cannot be ignored and which you as teachers will encounter when you meet them, when you discuss these issues with them. Those non-Christian sources of information are teaching something very different from what is being instilled in them or taught to them in their families or in their churches or in their communities. The idea that there are no absolute standards of right and wrong, that evolution is true, that creation in the Bible is a myth, the idea of a fall of man, the flood of Noah, these are myths, that this world has been here for millions of years, man is much less significant than the Bible would indicate, we have indeed evolved from ape-like creatures, we're not really made in the image of God, and so on and so on. These views are being taught to children. And so there's a danger that children who have been influenced in this way, when they hear Bible stories or Christian teaching, even from people that they respect, these things will increasingly be seen as irrelevant. Now, I'm talking particularly about children who've been influenced very much by secular culture. If you're encountering such a child, then you need to be aware of those other influences. And that makes the job of the teacher very challenging, because if he or she seeks to teach the Bible, for example, as a moral standard and an absolute standard of truth, and to teach biblical standards of behavior and dress code and many other things, then if the child has been influenced by very different lines of thinking, they will rebel. They are more likely to push against what you're saying. That's natural. All of us are influenced by what we've been taught. This begins to form a foundation for our worldview, our way of seeing the world around us and understanding it. Of course, this works both ways. If you are growing up in a Christian home, or if children are being educated to understand the Christian faith, they are being given reasons why their adults who influence them, their teachers and their parents, why they believe certain things, then even from the youngest age, they are having foundations put in place which are good ones. And those foundations can be firm and strong so that later on they're able to defend what they believe. They're not always in the retreat. You need to teach them, I need to teach children to find answers, to know how to defend their faith, and to have confidence to do so. And it's not the case that children are too young to understand some basic principles. They are well able to do so. If we teach them that God is creator, that God's word is true, that's my conviction, that the Bible does answer life's big questions. For example, if we teach them that before Adam came into the world, there was not millions of years of death and suffering and struggle in the animal kingdom. Adam was the first man, made in the image of God, then that is going to give them a very different way of thinking about the world than the secular view. And if they know how to defend this in the marketplace of ideas, then they will be immunized, in a sense. They will be protected against that worldly teaching they will encounter. All of us encounter worldly teaching. Influences that are secular, anti-Christian, anti-God, and that is happening more and more in the Western world. So we can inoculate, if you like, or insulate young minds against falsehoods. You might say, well, that's indoctrination. It is. But all children receive indoctrination. The only question is, what are they indoctrinated with? In fact, the biblical word translated teaching in the New Testament is the same word for indoctrination. There are not distinctions between teaching and indoctrination in the New Testament. So whether the source of the attacks on a child's beliefs is from the Bible, from the world's influence, from their own sinful heart, or from the devil himself, let's be blunt. There are three avenues of attack. They will have more likelihood, a better chance of defending what they believe if they have had good teaching put in place. We are well aware, if you're a Christian, that the average person in society sees the Bible believer like the ostrich. You hide your head in the sand, you don't really live in the real world. This is the idea they have. You believe Genesis is history. You really believe in a talking snake in the Garden of Eden and the animals going onto the ark 2 by 2? People scoff. They mock at these things. And they think there can be no possible correspondence between the Bible's historical teachings and the real world of science, of biology, of geology, of anthropology, of geography. They could not be more wrong. But we have to think carefully about how to deal with this issue with young people. And actually, the principles are the same for adults as they are for young people and children, but we have to find ways of breaking it down to simple, so the teaching is at a simple level. Many people think that this debate of origins, of creation, evolution, is about the quantity of evidence. The person who has the most evidence wins the debate. That's the idea, isn't it? And evolutionists often say on the world's media, there is mountains of evidence for evolution, and the implication is that you poor Christians need to just get real. You need to wake up. You need to just accept the facts. If you buy into this, if you accept this way of thinking, then you will feel very intimidated in this debate. But it's actually completely incorrect, this way of thinking. It's not a battle of who has the most evidence, but it's a battle of worldviews. It's a conflict of ideologies. It's a disagreement between a person who has a belief that there is a creator God who is all-powerful, who's revealed himself in his word, and on the other hand, a person who has rejected God as creator and does not accept the Bible as a divine revelation and doesn't accept Jesus Christ as the Son of God. That is the bottom line. That is what the debate is about. It's not about the Bible versus science, against science. It's about Christianity versus secularism. Christianity has at its foundation a belief that God is creator and that there are absolutes. Humanism has at its foundation an evolutionary view and that morality is relative, a matter of opinion. Your opinion might be different from the next person, which might be different from the next person. So different people's worldviews are coming into collision. But we all have the same facts. As we look at this world, we have the same facts of biology. We all observe the same plants and animals. We have the same facts of anthropology. We all see the same people, the different so-called races around the world today. We all observe there's suffering and death in our world. We can all see the same facts of astronomy through our telescopes, the same stars and galaxies, and you could go on. But it's your perspective that will be different because of your beliefs about origins being different from the person who has a different worldview. Let me illustrate that with some pictures. And this man is about to dive off this diving board into a pool of water. Or is he? Well, actually, if he did that, he would bang his head very hard because he would be diving into a paving stone. This is a chalk drawing on the street, a very clever one. This is not actually a giant Coca-Cola bottle. It's not the real thing. It's drawn in chalk on the street. From his perspective, from where he is crouching down, it is a two-dimensional drawing. But from where we are looking, it appears three-dimensional. The same is true of this picture. It's actually not wet because that water is drawn. The drain into which the water is pouring is drawn with chalk. Even the water coming out of the hose pipe is drawn cleverly by that man. He's put himself in the picture at a particular point, and from the perspective of the camera, it looks three-dimensional. Here's another one. They are not actually looking into a hole in which is a Roman mosaic. They are looking at a flat drawing on the street. Now, why am I showing you these pictures? Because I want to show you that your perspective depends on where you are standing. Let me repeat that. Your perspective, how you see something, depends on where you are standing. Your beliefs influence what you see. Here's another one, and I will explain this. He looks like he's a little man standing on the globe, on top of the world. But actually, he was stood at the right-hand end of this picture. The camera was facing up the street from the left-hand side, and because the drawing was made in this elongated fashion, it shortened the image and made it appear three-dimensional. Do you see that? So, how you see things depends on where you are standing. How you view the origins debate, creation versus evolution, or an earth of thousands of years old against the idea that the earth is billions of years old, that is the same. It depends on your underlying ideology, your philosophy of life. We have the same facts of science, like I've told you already, the same rocks and fossils and animals and birds and people, the same DNA. DNA is not of itself proof of evolution, as some people claim. Absolutely ridiculous. It's merely a sophisticated piece of software. It has a story to tell us, I suppose, depending on your ideology, depending on where you're standing in the debate. And because we have the same facts of science, and you can teach this to children, we have the same science. Science is a way of working out how the world works, finding out how things are put together, why things are the way that as they are in the present day world. In science, you test an idea by doing some experiments or testing something, and you make observations, you look at things, you measure things, and you get some results of your experiments. And depending on the results, you make a decision about whether your idea was correct or incorrect. That is how science works. And that means that whoever you are, whatever your worldview, your ideological beliefs, you can all do science. But different people doing different science, as long as they use a scientific method, will come to the same conclusions. So what does this have to say about the origins debate? Well, the scientific method is what you do in the present day world with things that exist in the present. But when we're thinking about how did everything get here, where did the universe come from, where did the first cell come from, where did DNA come from, where did people come from, that is a different question entirely. That depends on what someone already believes foundationally, what philosophy of life they have. If you believe in the historical record of Genesis, I do that. In other words, you take the Bible as history, in that case, from the first 11 chapters. You believe it's the Word of God. By the way, that is how Jesus Christ understood Genesis. It is how the Apostle Paul, the Apostle Peter, Luke, and so on, they understood Genesis as history without any doubt. That is not really controversial. The question is, do Christians today need to believe what Luke, Peter, Paul, and Christ believed? I would say that's a fairly important question. If you believe what they believed about history, you will be looking at this world through biblical glasses. In other words, a picture, a metaphor for how to see and understand the world. On the other hand, you can look at this world based on men's opinions about history. And I used to look at the world this way as a committed Christian, believing in evolution as God's method, until I started to examine the facts scientifically and also theologically. And I realized that the scientific ideas of evolution did not agree at all with the biblical record. But you can look at the world from different points of view. So again, let me tell you, it's a conflict of worldviews, this debate, not a conflict of facts. And you can teach children this at a basic level. You can describe to them that they need to see the world through Bible glasses. You can tell them, what I'm saying is that you believe what the Bible teaches. That's what I would encourage you to do. A non-Christian worldview looks something like this. Before I describe it, make this clear. I'm not saying a person who has this worldview is wicked or immoral. I'm saying that they have a worldview that is not read from the Bible. That's what I'm saying. A person could be very morally upright, a good person. Atheists can live moral lives to a large extent with this type of worldview. But what I am saying is it's non-Christian because there is no hint of it in the Bible. It involves billions of years of death and suffering and bloodshed leading to our existence as human beings. That's very different from a Christian worldview that might look something like this. Clearly, a Christian worldview must involve Christ coming into the world. You can see that there in this picture. It must involve the cross of Christ, his death and sacrifice for sins. And a Christian worldview always includes some teaching about the second coming of Jesus Christ, a new heavens and a new earth. There are differences among Christians about some of the details of the future things, but the fundamentals are very much understood. But how many Christians today are prepared to say, I believe in a creation, a perfect creation, ruined by the fall of man when Adam sinned, where death and suffering and decay and disease and mutations causing cancer came into the world, that they believe what Genesis chapters 6, 7, 8 and 9 tell us about the flood of Noah, and that they believe in the Tower of Babel being real history in Genesis 10 and 11, and the division of humanity into people groups along language lines. Language barriers were created effectively, and people had to stop building, and then they migrated to different parts of the world. Now, I suggest to you that that is a Christian worldview, including the history in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Let me give you some thoughts here. The first 11 chapters of Genesis take you to 1,757 years after creation. We can be that precise. Even if you think it's longer, let's just imagine it's as short as 1,757 years. Do you realize that is more than, that is 30% of the timeline of Earth history from a a 6,000 years perspective, if you happen to believe that. If you take the Old Testament as a whole, and then you look at Genesis, the first 11 chapters, it's a very significant proportion of the whole Old Testament. In fact, if you take Genesis as a whole book, the first book of the Bible, it is 2,300 years, which is well over half the entire Old Testament. I think that tells us something about the importance of the book of Genesis. And I think these are the kinds of things that we can teach children on a basic level. Should we leave the Bible out of our picture of origins? Should we discuss origins purely from a scientific point of view and not worry about the debate about where faith connects to that? Well, I would say no, because I think the Bible is the history book of the universe. Of course, it's more than a history book, but it also is a history book. There is no question about it. And as a Christian, I believe we need to teach this history as part of the framework for understanding origins, whether it's adults or children. I would say this, that it's God's eyewitness account of Earth history, of origins. It's not a scientific account. In fact, Genesis chapter 1 is a series of creative acts of God, miracles. There's nothing pretending to be scientific there at any point, but we ignore it at our peril. When Paul was speaking to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, he told him to be ready to preach the truth and to be ready to expose or bring to light things which needed to be brought to light, to convince people. I've highlighted a word there, which in the original Greek means to refute people in argument and to bring shame upon them if they're bringing arguments that are counter to Scripture. It has this idea of bringing people to shame. It's a very strong word. And part of good education is to use convincing argument. Just as an aside, or a sidestep, if you're a Christian, you know that you never convince anybody into the kingdom of God. It's the Holy Spirit who does that, God the Holy Spirit. But we are given a mandate, we are given permission by God to use convincing argument in our reasoning with skeptics, with those who are disbelieving. So I've got three statements like this on the slides, which I'm going to illustrate in just a moment. We need to show students the moral link between this issue of creation evolution and we need to show them the link between morality and Christianity and this debate on creation evolution. Dignity of human beings, purpose in life, these things are part of that important debate. If it's just about science, a lot of people switch off. They're not interested. But when people realize that it's about human beings and who we are and where we came from, then it's more relevant. And as a strategy, I think you can demonstrate the relevance or the importance of this debate to young people. Obviously, this is important for teenagers, but I think you can start when they're younger, even at primary school. Help children to see that what we believe about where we came from will have an impact on how we live and how we behave. You can tell children that if they are believing they came from animals, they're just animals, they might behave like animals. And it's giving them a reason for your statement, not just saying you must believe this or you should believe this. That may be enough when they're very young, but even at a young age, you can give them reasons. All my children at different ages said to me when they were young, "But Daddy, why?" And then you answer the question and immediately they come back with, "Why? But why?" Children ask why, and I think we can answer those questions. So, for example, here is an actual publication, an actual scientific publication by a top scientist in the United Kingdom called Simon Conway Morris. And in August 2003, he published an article entitled, in the English, "Once We Were Worms." In other words, if you go back many, many hundreds of millions of years, our ancestors were worms. We've evolved a long way since then. Now, if we teach generations of children that that kind of thing is true, will there not be some of them that begin to think that life is not very important, they're not accountable to anybody, and that they can live as they choose? If you're just an animal, if you were just once insignificant little worms, then maybe people will behave like animals. And sadly, all over the world, we see terrible, tragic cases of people in their teens, in their teenage years, who start acting on that kind of teaching. People who shoot their teachers and their fellow children in schools. It's happened in several countries around the world. And those people have had as their inspiration evolutionary beliefs. Many cases, it's not reported in the media, but they wear a t-shirt like natural selection. And they make it clear in their writings or in their blogs or in their YouTube videos before they do this wicked act that they're doing it because of the inspiration of an evolutionary view. Survival of the fittest. We're killing off the weakest. And if we're just animals, that is the kind of thing which can happen. I'm not saying that all people who believe in evolution are wicked, unlikely to be doing things like that. Of course not. But there is a connection, and youngest children can learn and understand something of that connection. But you also are able, I believe, to expose weaknesses and problems with evolutionary ideas. And you can discuss this. I don't think it's good to teach children to have no respect for those people. I think it's important to show them that evolutionary people who believe evolution are intelligent and often very honest people, but they have the wrong way of thinking. I think it's counterproductive to teach them that they're wicked and dishonest or mad. That may be the way that some atheists attack Christians, but that we do not play them at that game. We respect them ultimately because they're made in the image of God as well. But some of their ideas are frankly ridiculous and actually deceitful. Here's an example. This is the kind of thing which you may have discovered in the past. It may not be one you would use with primary school children, but you know the kind of thing. If I share this, I think you will understand what I'm saying. If you teach people that in their mother's womb, in the uterus, before they're born, they pass through various stages as the embryo grows that look like animals, then they are going to think very differently about what it means to be human and made in the image of God. Well, Ernst Haeckel, a German biologist at the end of the 19th century, taught exactly that. He was a bit younger than Charles Darwin, very impressed with Charles Darwin's theory, and he developed an idea in Germany that said, as you develop in your mother's womb, you revisit the stages that we went through in our evolutionary ancestry, from a fish to an amphibian, like a salamander, a reptile, a bird, a mammal, a primate, a monkey of some kind, and human. You pass through these stages. And he drew these pictures. And he claimed we had a tail, we had gill slits, and so on. But this was false. You can find out more detail on the website, creation.com, but I'm just going to tell you that this was false. And yet, even though it was proven false in his lifetime by a university court, these pictures have appeared in textbooks since that time, even in this last decade. And his embryo drawings were nothing like the actual embryos. A paper published a few years ago in the prestigious Journal of Anatomy and Embryology by a man called Michael Richardson and colleagues who were embryologist experts all over the world showed just how bad his drawings were. Here are some more such embryos. The bottom two rows are different animals as the embryo, all at the same stage of development. They are very different from each other. But he drew them looking exactly the same to make his point. But it was deceitful. So that is the kind of thing which you can expose respectfully, not to ridicule people, but to show that things are not always what people are taught. You can find simpler examples for children, but of course this indoctrination, this type of deceit, increases as they get older. It's not something which they learn at 6 years old, but you can prepare them for some of these things as they get older. Something else that I think you can show children, and this is very, very powerful, is the issue of death. You may think, well, I don't want to discuss death with small children. I think children are much less sensitive than we so often think. If you told them that there is an idea called evolution, which says that animals changed into other animals over a very long time, and eventually into people, they can understand that. But if you told them that only the better animals were able to survive and the weaker ones died, and that this was a way of making an improvement over time, and death was a very important part of this process, they would, I think, realize that death is nasty, not good. Did you come into existence, little child, as a result of lots and lots of death? Would God have used a process involving lots and lots of death? At a very simple level, you can get them to think about that. I would then contrast that with what a straightforward reading of the Bible teaches us. Adam was made a perfect man, along with his wife Eve, and they were commanded not to eat of the forbidden fruit. But when they did that, as God had warned, death came into the world. Death is an enemy, as any person knows at a funeral. Death is not a good thing, and death is something that the Bible tells us will be taken away from this world in the future. Would God have used death to create life, and would he call it very good, which is what the last verse of Genesis chapter 1 says? God looked at everything he'd made at the end of the 6 days of creation and said it's very good. Does that make sense? You can teach this to children, I believe. You might want to do it in a sensitive way, but I think it's quite possible to do that. And they will see a huge problem with that way of thinking at the top of that picture. You can also show them pictures. I've shown 5-year-old children these pictures without the words on the screen and asked them, what are these creatures? And they have no problem recognizing that they are frogs. But then I tell them that some people believe these fossil frogs are up to 190 million years old. And you can easily see that there has been no change, no evolution to speak of in 190 million years. Children can see that they haven't changed. That is why they recognize them as frogs. And then you can say, some people believe in evolution, but here are some fossils that do not look like they have evolved. So you can get them to think about that. Even if a person believes evolution, they should have no problem being honest about showing such pictures to children. Should they? So if they're confident that evolution is true, they will want to show children all the facts at every age and let them make up their own minds. If evolution is so obvious, then such pictures should not be a problem. But they don't show such pictures in the context of evolution. They show something different. Here is another thing that any child can enjoy. It's an extinct marine animal called an ichthyosaur. It would look rather like a dolphin if it was alive today, but it's a reptile living in the sea, or it was. And it's giving birth to its baby ichthyosaur. And obviously, that must have been buried by mud very quickly. Because if it was buried slowly, then birth would have finished the little ichthyosaur and the mother ichthyosaur would have swum away. Anybody can learn a lesson there that to preserve that, it must have been very quickly buried. And that's the kind of thing that you can teach to show them that it is easier to understand these things as something that would happen in a flood. Something perhaps like the Bible teaches happened at the time of Noah. This is something else that I think many people can understand. If God declared everything was very good, and by the way, in the Hebrew, that means morally perfect and physically perfect, then really, should we believe that under the feet of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, there was already a fossil record? Is a fossil record a good thing when it contains evidence of a decay, disease, there are tumors in bones, cancers, teeth marks indicating animals ate other animals? Is this the kind of thing which went on for millions of years, and Adam and Eve were standing on fossiliferous rocks, and God was telling them, the world I've made is very good? I suggest to you that the God who would call that very good would not be the God of the Bible. He would be an ogre. He would be a cruel God. Or at the best, he would be uncaring about suffering. Instead of understanding those fossils as evidence for millions of years, I believe many of them, the majority of them, give us an idea of a flood that happened in the days of Noah. Something else you can do is show the time frame, and I apologize this slide is in English, show evidence for the biblical worldview and the biblical time frame. The biblical time frame is thousands of years, not billions or millions. You can show scientific evidence that is more consistent with that, that agrees with that. It would never prove it beyond doubt because it happened in history, but it seems much more compatible with the biblical time frame. Well, I've already shown you a number of things that relate to the creation, the fall, the flood. The fall, of course, is associated with the curse of God upon the creation, the sending of Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, the flood of Noah, and of course the confusion of the languages at Babel. And that type of history is something that I think you can have a lot to say to children about. We encourage people to get hold of a good resource. There are good resources in Dutch, and there are good resources also in English. This is a particularly useful one called Creation Magazine. And I'm just putting this in the presentation at this point to say that if your English is good, this is a great resource. You would have to adapt the material from the point of view of Dutch children, but it's a great resource. Good pictures, and some of the things I'm going to show you relate to this resource. Here is a picture of an island. And the simple question is, how old is it at the time of these pictures? And the answer is less than 12 months old. This island formed in the North Atlantic Ocean from volcanic eruptions in 1962, and after just 1 year, a mature-looking island, geologically, was in evidence. And some Icelandic geologists who went to visit it were absolutely amazed. And to quote one of them, when he saw the different geological features which he thought happened over tens or hundreds of millions of years, but he knew it had happened in less than 1 year, he said, it's almost beyond belief. This kind of evidence from geology doesn't prove the Bible's time frame, but it's consistent with it. If that can happen in 1 year, then we don't need millions of years to describe rock formation. Here is an interesting one. A piece of wood has been carved out, and into that piece of wood has been put butter. And that butter, for preserving it, it has been lowered into a bog, a peat bog. I don't know if you understand that word in Dutch, but it's where peat is cut and used as a fuel when it's dried out.
Veen, turf.
Okay. And this particular example is from Northern Ireland, and it was dug out of a bog and confirmed to be fossilized butter. So something soft had turned to hard stone. I have found another one in Cork in Southern Ireland in a museum, and they claim it to be at least 1,000 years old, and in the middle the butter is still soft, and on the outside the butter is turned to stone. Very interesting. What is the point of such things? Well, they interest people, adults and children, but they tell us something about fossilization. If you have something that was once living or soft or organic and it turned to stone, this doesn't mean it is very, very ancient, millions of years. It just means the right conditions or ingredients were there, present, able to preserve it. Something else that gets a lot of people thinking. We have many, many examples now of unfossilized soft dinosaur tissues being published by evolutionists themselves in the secular literature. In the top scientific journals, such as the journals Science or Nature, they're publishing these things. They find flexible, stretchy tissues. They find proteins now. They can work out the order of amino acid building blocks on the proteins. And they're so well preserved, they can compare these proteins to the same proteins in modern reptiles or birds. Collagen, elastin, laminin, keratin. This is amazing preservation. They find branching blood vessels like you see at the bottom of this picture. And when they squeezed it, out came liquid blood with blood cells in that liquid blood. And in the blood cells, they did tests and they found evidence of hemoglobin. That's quite surprising, however old these are. At most, they can be thousands of years old, because we know that these organic materials and these proteins, these molecules, cannot last more than 10,000 years under the very best conditions. But these are believed to be many thousands of times more old than that. At least 68 million years old in this particular case. That is the kind of information that will make an honest inquirer think. And even a child can understand that something soft and gooey cannot last for very long before rotting away. Here's another question that, and I will finish with this one. Something to make people think, something to encourage them to think about this evolutionary process. Ask people, do animals change? And anybody who thinks about that has to say, yep, I do know that some animals can change. Once someone's lived a little while and for instance, they've observed different breeds of dogs. There have been many different breeds of dogs over the years, which clearly are not millions, they don't go back to the dawn of time. Animals change, but what do they change into? Different kinds of animals, different types, different families? Or do they stay in their particular kind? Do they stay similar to that family? Is there a boundary which stops change happening infinitely? Well, natural selection is what Charles Darwin popularized as a mechanism for limitless change. Change that could not just change finches' beaks, but could change something that was not a finch into a finch over time. Something that could take a fish and gradually turn it into an amphibian and eventually into a human being. But natural selection does not have any creative power. It simply takes the existing genetic information, the DNA, selects from it, and an animal like a bird could never come from a reptile without new information being added. No evolutionist in the world at any leading university who knows his subject would disagree with that. So where does the new information come from in their belief about evolution? Well, they say that mutations, the copying mistakes when cells divide, The DNA is copied, but there may be occasionally a mistake in the DNA. And they say that that could be useful on occasions, and it could result in a new protein, and eventually in a new organ, and if you have millions of years, a completely new organism, a new type of animal, a new type of plant could come into existence. That's the theory. But natural selection on its own, it actually tends to keep animals and plants the same. But there are differences. You can have variety within big cats, and that means that you can have tigers and lions breeding together, such as you see here. This is called a liger. You can have variety within the camel family, and that means, because they're still related, you can have different camel family members breeding together. This is a llama breeding together with a camel. They are from different continents. According to evolution, they have been separated by at least 3 million years of time. But their DNA is so similar that they can still breed together. A jaguar from South America can breed with a leopard from Africa. They've been separated for at least 3 million years, but they can still breed together. And sometimes the offspring are fertile. Why is that surprising? Well, in only 6 million years, an ancestor of human beings and chimpanzees is supposed to have lived and split into two lines. 6 million years to create you and chimpanzees from an ancestor. But 3 million years didn't change these animals at all, and so they can still breed together. There's something very wrong with evolutionary theory, quite apart from any faith position you and I might have. So when I look at domestic dogs, for example, there may be tremendous variety. It's very interesting to compare a Chihuahua with a Great Dane. My daughter has a Chihuahua now. It's a tiny little dog. At full size, it's this big. And I joke that we don't really have, we have another dog, but I joke we have one dog and we have a Chihuahua. It's not, almost not a dog. But of course it is. It's got the same DNA code as a wolf. And I really mean that. The same DNA as a wolf. All of the domestic dogs and the wild dogs around the world can be bred together. They can form hybrids. You therefore could say that a wolf is the ancestor of all the canine family. And that is why you can take a poodle, a caniche, I think is what you say in Dutch, and you can breed it with a wolf. And these are the offspring of a wolf and a poodle. And they are, I have made that name up, Woodles. That doesn't exist. You won't be able to Google search it. But you can find information about crossbreeding. And it's very interesting, because the wolf from Berlin crossed, a male poodle crossed with a female wolf produced baby dogs, and they were then able to have more babies themselves. This is the grandchildren of that crossbreed. But you don't get this kind of thing. Why not? You can ask children. Because they're not the same kind. They're from a different family. In other words, when they get a bit older, the DNA code is a very different thing in a monkey or an ape compared to a dog. So there's nothing in the Bible that disagrees with biology and disagrees with genetics. That word kind, highlighted there, ard, it's a broader category. It's a bigger grouping than species. There are many species within one kind, one ard. And so dogs will continue to breed dogs, but they will not be ever related to pigeons or finches or people. So a good way of thinking about this, and I close with this slide, if you think of the middle picture, that is the picture that many people have in their minds, and it's misleading. It's incorrect. The idea is that God the Creator made every species in the world today just exactly as you see it, and geographically where you find it. No Christian who believes the Bible's history should accept that, because we know the flood reshaped the world's geography. It destroyed all of those niches, those habitats, those ecosystems from before the flood. But we also shouldn't accept this middle picture, because animals do change, as I've told you. So the bottom picture is more accurate. Each of those trees represents one family. Maybe the dog family, the horse family, the camel family, the dolphin family, the family of human beings. And within each family, there's lots of variety. But there are boundaries, there are limits to the amount of change that can take place according to the Genesis account. And we see those boundaries today, and we can see them in the DNA. And therefore, evolutionary family trees I would reject, because that suggests that change is limitless. We don't see that in biology. The top tree I reject. The bottom forest of trees, I think, is right. There are lots of family trees, not a family tree leading back to a common ancestor. Now, there's a lot of information there, and I hope it's been useful to you. You've listened very patiently for an hour, and I really appreciate that. I would encourage you to look at the literature afterwards. We have a book in English that answers all the commonly asked questions, called the Answers Book, and that book is also translated into Dutch. And although the cover and the title are different in Dutch, I can't pronounce that, it's the same book. And I think the same illustrations as well. So do make use of this. There are some other little booklets that I would encourage you to look at that deal with the flood of Noah, and also with 4 commonly asked questions about the races. How do we know God exists? What would the evidence be? Other questions of that nature. I also mentioned Jesus and the New Testament writers believed in a literal Genesis. If you want some support for that statement, then this little book is Genesis History, or 15 Reasons to Believe Genesis is History, is very good. I've been coming over to this country. It's been my privilege to speak at the Driestar here and many places over the last 12 years. And these are quite old talks, but the information is still up to date. It may not have some of the latest examples, but the information is still accurate. And I believe you can find some of these DVDs at the back on these subjects. So do look at these pictures. Do look at these DVDs, because you'll get some of the illustrations that I've been using, and you'll get some other arguments. There are some DVDs in English as well. And of course, there's that magazine Creation that I mentioned earlier. It's a colourful magazine that deals with all aspects of this issue. This is one that's very interesting. A shark that is eating lettuce in an aquarium in Birmingham in the UK. Why do sharks eat lettuce? Well, maybe, just maybe, it's because they really were vegetarian animals in the beginning, as some people would think from Genesis. There's a children's section in the middle of this particular magazine. In each case, there's 4 pages for the sort of age group you're reaching people with, and it deals with lots and lots of creation, evolution issues. Of course, it's in English, but you'd have to adapt it. But do look at these resources, and do feel free to come and ask questions afterwards. I think that's it. I was going to mention one more resource. Here we are. I think you may find some of these at the back as well. Very important question to know the answer to. Why is there death and suffering? And I would encourage you to look at this book if you're interested in history. It's not really science. After the flood. A fascinating look at how European peoples and Scandinavian peoples trace their history all the way back to Japheth, son of Adam. Did you know that? Very interesting, very surprising information to some people. Well, I don't know if you want to ask a question formally. You're welcome to ask me a question informally, but if anybody wants to ask a question or two now, you're welcome to do so. Okay.
I do have a question. It's about First Epistle of Peter, you mentioned.
Always be ready to give. Yes?
Do you think we as Christians should do that actively or passively?
That's a very good question. Should Christians defend their faith, and in this case it's talking about their hope in Jesus Christ, should they do it actively or passively? I have absolutely no doubt that Peter meant us to do it actively, but of course respectfully. It's of course true that some people in their family situation, they have to live a life of example before their family members, and some people have to do the same in their working situation, because though they have tried a number of times to testify to their faith in Jesus Christ and about Christian faith, they've met with a lot of opposition. So they have to live a life of example. But we shouldn't only wait for opportunity. We should not merely wait for opportunities. It's my conviction that we should pray for opportunities. That's a word for true Christians. We should look for opportunities to be an influence in this world for Jesus Christ. Jesus described it as being salt and light in society. And when you look at the state of our culture, whether it's the Netherlands or the UK or France, where I've just come from this morning, then you can clearly see a desperate need for Christians to have an influence in the culture. And that will not happen if the minority of people who are Christians, it's only the minority of people who are Christians. If we only rely on passive means of communicating that, then we won't be doing a very effective job.
Yes, I do agree, but the thing is, if you, like in university, the consensus is that evolution is true. And if you confess that you're a Christian, you obviously get a lot of questions. But, you know, you don't always like being questioned, and, you know, it can be even quite hard.
In a university setting, if you're a student at university, then of course you're going to have to be resourceful, and you're going to have to choose your opportunities carefully. The Bible says in the book of Proverbs, there's a time for everything. There's a time to speak, and there's a time to be silent, and we need the wisdom to know which is which. Of course, that's true. For example, in my situation, when I'm going to speak in a university, a secular university, and give a public lecture, I make it clear that I'm a Christian. I make it clear that I believe in creation. I often make a joke that I'm one of those crazy people who believes the Bible's actual history. I'm a creationist, as some people would call me a creationist. But then I proceed to give them a scientific lecture, and I show them, not that I'm clever, but that Christian faith can be defended in the marketplace of ideas. As you can imagine, there's often a very big discussion afterwards, and although some of the questions are definitely on the scientific details, and I do my best to address those, always, there are many questions about faith. So I've gone to a university, kept the topic on the science, but because I know I'm a Christian, when they can't argue with the science, they then try to challenge me on faith. And we have to be ready to defend what we believe. Anybody else before we just stop? Okay, well, thank you very much. You're welcome to come up to me afterwards and ask questions as well. Do talk to people from Media Group in Genesis sitting to my right if you want to find out more information about resources in Dutch for yourselves and for reaching children. Okay, thank you.